right. Um, I guess we're live.
Yes.
My name is Douglas Preston. I'm an author and a huge fan of David Baldacci. He's actually one of my favorite writers. And I read him not just for pleasure, but I read him to study his books. He's, when people ask me, or aspiring writers ask me if they want to write thrillers, what should they do? And one of the things I say is to study other thrillers, to read them, to take them apart, to figure out what makes them great. And I recommend Baldacci for his books are masterpieces of pacing, plotting, characterization, twists and turns and scene setting. And it's really it's so I don't read them just for pleasure, although they are enormously pleasurable to read and fun to read, but also because I learned so much from them. And also, I'm a little bit, uh, what's the word? A little bit discouraged by them because they're so good. And I aspire to be able to write books like that. Um, so I won't spend a lot of time introducing David because you're all, I'm sure, huge fans of his. But he started out as a lawyer. He practiced law for some years, and then he turned to novel writing. His first novel was Absolute Power, which was a absolutely fantastic book, a huge bestseller. It was made into the film with Clint Eastwood and Gene Hackman. And since that time, he's written 50 novels, more or less. I think that's about right, and about half a dozen children's books. Along the way, garnering many literary awards and also quite a few other movies and other interesting projects. And I'm just going to conclude by saying that David and his wife Michelle are two of the most incredibly generous people that I know. He is the founder with Michelle of the Wish You Well Foundation, which is an incredibly effective charitable foundation which encourages and funds adult literacy programs. He's been involved with the Mark Twain House and Museum, which is puts on, first of all, they take care of Mark Twain's beautiful house in Connecticut and also fund wonderful literary programs. One of my favorite places. And he also supports a lot of other charitable causes, including the Authors Guild, the Multiple Sclerosis Society, and so forth. So anyway, we are here to talk about this book, this fantastic book, which it took me about all of 5 hours to read. It was one of those books, like all his books, which you start and you just can't stop, and you end up staying up too late, and you're annoyed, and then you wake up the next morning groggy, and it's all very annoying. His books, I got to tell you. But anyway, it's a wonderful read. So I had a few questions for David, and then I have a bunch of questions from the audience, some really good questions here. So, but anyway, in reading this book, it's the third book in the 620 Man series, which, what a clever title, 620 Man, the guy who gets on the train at 6:20 and goes into work, and well, all of a sudden, or is drawn into amazing, incredible, and frightening adventures. But so I'm curious, and I'm going to ask questions that I think a writer would ask rather than a reader. But when you begin a book, like the first book in this series, do you know how the whole series is going to end before you begin, or do you even know how the book is going to end, or do you sort of let the story drive itself?
Yeah, well, let me say, first of all, Doug, thank you for doing this. I'm a big fan of yours. I read your works, and you're top notch. You're, class A level, and I'm thrilled to be able to sit down and have a conversation with you. Thank you very much for your kind words. Um, I I never know the ending of the book before I sit down to write it. I'm sort of a pantser. I let it grow organically. And I wrote The 620 Man because sometimes I write books to answer questions I don't think have been answered. And I read two papers by this international journalism consortium about the Panama Papers and the Pandora Papers, about $30 trillion of dark money floating around the world. So my question was, what do you do with $30 trillion of money? And I figured you probably wouldn't do it, use it to buy the 10th jet or the 11th yacht, but you might do it to tip the world even more in your favor. So that's where the 620 man sort of idea came from. And I do a little bit of an outline, not a whole lot, because for me it's a little bit of a waste of time because almost all of the time I never use any of the outline of the novel. It just sort of gets me a little bit going. I sit down and I have a character of mine, Travis Devine, in the 620 Man series, and to die for. I had something at the end of the last book, The Edge, where he had another woman on his trail. She wanted to kill him because she had failed to do so. So he had that on his rear flank, and then coming up in front of him was a new mission out in Seattle. And he had to go out there to guard a 12-year-old girl. And really, my first thought with the novel was to bring a character back, you don't want to just have another plot for them to sort of march through without changing. You want to evolve the character. And the way you can evolve characters sometimes is placing brand new challenges in front of them. And with him, it was a very distinct challenge. It was a 12-year-old girl named Betsy Odom. He has a lot of skill sets and he can do a lot of things. He is absolutely clueless what to do with the 12-year-old girl. And because of that, I had to reveal more things in his personality that you probably didn't see in previous books because of that new challenge in front of him, that new kryptonite that he had to work himself around. So I just let the story grow organically. And I go on the same journey as the reader does, and I think that keeps me a little bit fresh because I've always felt if I had the outline and I knew what the ending was going to go, I'm not writing a story, I'm just typing to a predetermined conclusion. It's not nearly as exciting.
Well, that's interesting. I mean, these characters in this novel, I mean, Betsy Odom, the 12-year-old girl, is really a fantastic character. And, I don't know, I mean, did you ever raise a 12-year-old girl yourself? Because you really nailed her. And I was really impressed by that. How did you create that character?
I did raise a 12-year-old girl, and she's 31 now. And as a father, those years are indelibly imprinted onto your soul. The battles that you fight and, trying just to get through that time period in both your lives. I had a fine fence to straddle with her. She had just lost her parents, a very traumatic event. She's a street smart sort of girl because her parents never got their act together. She was homeless sometimes, hungry sometimes. So she really had to grow up quickly. And I wanted to show that smart side, the sassy side, the ballsy side that, okay, I can, you're an adult, so what? I can fight you on the same level. But I also had to balance that with the fact that she's 12 years old and she just lost her parents horrifically. And I needed to show that vulnerability and fragility of a young girl. At the same time, I was also trying to show this confident, more adult side of her. So I had to go back and forth and make sure that I spent time on each phases of her personality. Otherwise, she would come across as being inauthentic because you would be like, nobody, could just, sail through that without being touched by it. She lost her parents, for God's sakes. So I had to go back and forth and make sure that I grimly balanced her personality out. But I did draw upon, my time with my own daughter growing up, and you're going in, I don't want to say into battle, but you're going into difficult ground where neither one knows what the outcome is going to be. Each side sometimes gets the hair on the back of their necks up and they don't want to give any ground. But at the end of the day, you have to sort of reach a compromise. And the only way you do that, I found, at least with my daughter, I needed to find a channel that I could communicate with her through, something she was comfortable with. Not so much me, because I was the parent. I really had to give up a little bit more than she did. But that's the only way I got through it. And I sort of drew upon that when I was writing not just Betsy's character, but also the way Divine tried to communicate with her and build a relationship and a bond.
Yeah, it's very, she's really great. She's a perfect balancing act of sarcasm and defiance, along with vulnerability and something really, and also the fact that she's just been touched by this terrible tragedy. I'm curious, has your 31-year-old daughter read this book yet, and does she have any commentary on Betsy?
She has not read it yet, but she's going to read it. She's finishing up her last year of law school. So as soon as that's done, I'm sure she'll read it. She's read a lot of my novels, and I'm sure she'll have comments about Betsy Odom. And the other funny thing about Betsy is there are 4 charity auction winner names in this novel. I auction off names to help charities. And Betsy Odom, she bid on this last year at one of the book festivals my wife and I do. And Betsy, the real Betsy Odom, is, I think, around 70 years old. So when I sent her a copy of the book, I said, dear Betsy, here's to the fountain of youth. You're 12 years old. So
Well, that's good.
it is kind of good. And so I think my daughter definitely will have comments about it. And she may come back and say, yeah, Dad, remember that time? Let's talk about that.
Well, it's great. I mean, that's the hardest thing to do for me, is to imagine a character who's so different from I Am, and you do that so well. I mean, your other characters are amazing. I mean, Travis Devine, what a great character he is. I mean, and here he is, this really capable guy in every way, and all of a sudden he's got his hands full with a 12-year-old girl, and he really doesn't know what the hell he's doing.
He doesn't. And when you have a character like, and you've gone through the same thing, characters with special skill sets who can do extraordinary things. That's all well and good, and readers get that and they like that, but you have to balance that with a way to connect with the reader. So you have this hero or heroine up there, and you have to bring them back down to earth and find a way for the reader to connect. And the way you do that, at least for me, is vulnerability. They're not always have the right answer. And sometimes they're not sure the right decision to make. They fall down, they get beaten, and they have to get back up and move forward again, because we all experience that in life. So what I try to do with Divine, even though he was an Army Ranger and he can do certain things that most people can't do, he still stumbles in life a lot. He doesn't always have the right answer. And readers connect with that because we authentically feel that same way. I'm like, everybody's had a day where nothing in their whole life went right. And they fell down 5 times and they had to get back up and figure out a way to keep going forward. So that's how I sort of balance Divine's special skill set with him being able to connect with an everyday reader. And that's really important for me because I don't want to read about a superhero without a cape on. I want to read about somebody who's got some challenges and difficulties and sometimes doesn't make the right choice.
Yeah, and in this book, there are a couple of instances where he really does mess up pretty bad. Like when the house blows up. That, which is that's a brave thing to do for you because you don't want to lose the reader's respect for the character. But at the same time, as you say, you don't want a Superman who's just can do everything. So
Right.
it's really, really, you pull that off very well.
Thank you. Well, it's the reason we all keep writing books is we have different challenges with every book. And some people ask me, you've written so many novels, it must get easier. And I said, no, it actually gets harder. And they say, why does it get harder? I said, because I know now after all these books how good it can be if you just work a little harder and you
Yeah.
think of better words and you build better characters because you're almost at the top of the shiny beacon hill. You're never actually going to get to the top, but it's within sight now after so many novels. And you just strive to make it better than ever. And so it doesn't get any easier. It really doesn't.
Well, that's one of the things I wanted to ask you about because, not to criticize other novelists, but many successful novelists, after having written 40 or 50 books, fall into a rut. I mean, they start writing the same book, and obviously I don't mean this as any kind of general criticism, but in your case, you always write a new book. It's always fresh. It always has characters in it that we haven't seen before, even if it's a series book. How do you do that? How do you keep the freshness, the energy in those books when I know how hard that is because I've written 40 books myself. I
I
mean,
know you do. I know. And you've solved that dilemma as well, but it is a true dilemma. Because after a while you could ask yourself the question, I have a new book to write. How did I do it last time? And then you just sort of make the same story and you change some of the names and you've met your deadline and off it goes to the publisher. For me, I mean, I spent, 15 years of my life writing short stories. I never thought I was going to be a writer for a living. I thought I was going to be a lawyer. I love writing fiction, but I never thought I'd make a living doing it. And I wrote short stories and screenplays and eventually novels. But I always sit down and write just for the sheer joy. I know it's hard work. It is. And you get flustered and frustrating, and some days are better than others. But I never lost that, 8-year-old little boy's imagination of sitting down and thinking, I get paid to make stuff up for a living. How absolutely cool is that? How many people can say that in their lives? So when I have writer friends who say, oh my God, I got a deadline coming up. I've got another 150 pages to write. This is just killing me. And I say, take a step back. And I tell them, we make our living by making stuff up. Just think about that for like 5 seconds. And then all this woe is me kind of stuff should go out the door because it's a special profession, to be able to do that. And so every book that I write, I try to write things that interest me. I write about things I don't necessarily know a lot about. I write about things that I'd like to know a lot about. And then I just go after that with passion and immerse myself in that world. And when you find out all these really cool facts and data and, little Easter eggs, and you dive into characters who are in a special field that you really find interesting, compelling. When you sit down to write the story, it's like your creative tank is just brimming with, energy. Whereas if you're just writing a book just to write a book because you got a contract deadline, or the character you're writing needs to have another book written about them, that same level of energy is not there. I think the one attribute a writer has to have is curiosity. When I was growing up, I was like Harriet the Spy. I was Harry the Spy. I was so curious about everybody. I eavesdropped. I watched people. I followed them around. I listened to how they interacted and all that. I just found it fascinating. And I've never lost that drive, that motor, that belly fire about this is what stories are. And so I've never really thought about becoming an assembly line and, just doing the same story over and over again. I write about things that really interest me every new day that I sit down. And that's how I sort of break out of the mold of just turning another book in because I have to turn the book in. I've never approached storytelling any other way, and I don't think I will. I'm still an 8-year-old kid just having fun.
Well, that's good to hear. I've often thought that the most successful people in the world are the ones who never grew up,
Right.
who
That's
retained their 8-year-old love of freshness, of discovery. And in your books, you can see the research you do. I mean, in this book too. I mean, in all your books, I can feel the fresh research that you've done. You're not just coasting on what you know. I mean, we always hear this advice: write what you know about. Well, I don't believe that. And I don't think you do either, because you just said it. You just said, I'm curious. I want to know new things. And when you do find out new things, you're writing about what you don't know, but you're going to know it because you're going to find out about it.
Yeah, I always give the example of the book Seabiscuit about the horse from the 1930s. Laura Hillenbrand wrote that novel. When she wrote that book, she had chronic fatigue syndrome. So she never was able to leave her house the years that she's writing the book. Never been to a racetrack, never ridden a horse, but she was in love with Seabiscuit. So she read everything there was to know about the race horsing in the 1930s, about this horse in particular, all of his competitors. And she immersed herself in that world because she was so curious about it, and wrote one of the finest nonfiction novels about horse racing and a particular horse I've ever read. So that really is an example I try to give to people. She didn't know anything about horse racing, but she wanted to know about it. And that passion comes through in her prose and her characters and her plot and the dialogue, everything. And it just makes a huge difference. So if you're a new writer trying to break in, and granted that we all know competition is fierce, the way to break into the field is by bringing to that passion to a project. Don't chase trends. I mean, when I was writing Absolute Power, um, Jurassic Park came out, and I swear to God, every book proposal after that had a dinosaur in it. Every script written in Hollywood had a T-Rex running down. Even if it was a romantic comedy, there was a T-Rex, running down the hallway because people were chasing trends. This is hot. I need to jump on this bandwagon. But the thing is that they already had Michael Crichton's franchise. They didn't need you, and it wouldn't have been a good book anyway because you weren't interested in dinosaurs. You just thought it was a trend where you could make a quick sale. So you got to find that thing you're interested in, particularly for your first novel.
Yeah, that is really true. That's really good advice. And before we leave this book, I just want to say this character, Prue Jackson. Now,
Yeah.
what a cool character she is. I mean, I just want to ask you where that character came from, because that is really sui generis, as the lawyers say. She's unique. Um,
Well,
where did she come from?
at the end of the previous Travis Devine book, The Edge, she was the girl on the train. In that book, she tried to kill him because she's a mercenary. She was hired to take him out on a train between Geneva and Milan, and she failed. Devine was too good for her back then, but she's still on the trail, and she leaves him a note at the end of The Edge saying, "I'm coming for you, and this time I'm going to take you out." So, okay, the book was done, and I moved on to another book that I was working on, but I still had the character Prue Jackson in my mind. So I could have gone down two paths. I could have gone down the traditional path. She's the antagonist. We're going to play that one straight all the way through, To Die For, and that's the way that's going to play out. And when I came back to write To Die For, I was like, why take the easy way out? Why do it that way? Just playing her straight up. Let's have some fun with her. Let's change her character, and let's see if we can make something even more complicated and bewildering for Divine. And that's what I came, to fruition. So that's what I wanted to do. So how do I build her backstory, which you really didn't know about in The Edge at all? She was just sort of this mysterious character. So I built a backstory, one that gave her a little bit of baggage, as I like to call it, some personal dilemmas and challenges in her past that she really had to overcome. So that made you, as a reader, wow, she's been through hell and back. I sort of sympathize a little bit with her. I'm sort of rooting for her. I hope she turns out to be a good person. And I made her character a lot more complicated. And as she learns more about Divine and what he's involved in and out in Seattle, there's a little bit of sympathy and compassion that comes into her character as well for him. And then I thought, once I build that foundation, then I can take her character and her action model in any direction I want. And I picked the one that comes through in the novel. But that was me just saying at the very get-go, why play it safe and straight with her? Let's have some fun with that character. And I got to tell you, every time I've done that, when I've sort of gone off the board for 200, Alex, it's paid off for me. And it just makes it a lot more fun to write too. I think if I'd written her straight, I would have been going through the motions, just typing. Yeah, I know where it's going. The way I played it actually out and To Die For, it was just so much fun and so much better.
Yeah, I mean it's really fun for the reader because you meet her kind of obliquely, and she's not, you don't get a good vibe at all. Of course, you know that she's up to no good, really dangerous character, and you don't really know which way she's going to go.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to say which way she goes because I don't want to spoil that, but it's a really great twist, as the other great twists are in the book, which I won't mention either. But anyway, it's a wonderful book because it has all the, it foils the reader's expectations. And I think that that's one of the characteristics of an excellent story, is that your expectations are foiled, the world is turned upside down, but at the same time you say, oh, damn, I should have seen that coming. It doesn't come out of the blue. It's not totally crazy, but you didn't expect it. And
Right.
those are the keys to a great story. This is, again, I'm talking about, if you want to be a writer, read Baldacci because he does it so well.
Thank you.
So, but I'm curious now. You did mention a little bit, you wrote a lot of short stories when you were a kid and so forth. I'm curious to hear a little bit about your arc from a young person to law school, to a lawyer practicing law, and then bam, you're a writer. Tell us about that.
So when I grew up in Richmond, Virginia in the 60s and 70s. And as a little boy, I never really shut up. I talked all the time. In fact, when I was 5 years old, people started calling me the Austin Avenue, which is the street I grew up on, the Austin Avenue lawyer. And I grew up to be a trial lawyer. So, that was sort of prophetic. But I love to read. I think every writer you ask, were you a reader as a kid? They will say yes. I mean, I never met a writer who wasn't a reader from a young age. And books really saved me. I grew up during Jim Crow and a totally racist and segregated society. And I grew up with a lot of people who thought that was perfectly fine and natural and normal. And my parents took my brother and sister and I to the library every week, and I checked out, tons of books. I like to say that even though I never left Virginia as a child because I didn't have the opportunity, I sort of took one from Mark Twain, and one of his favorite quotes is, "Travel is fatal to prejudice." He was the most traveled person of his time. He circumnavigated the world several times on his speaking tours. And his point was, if you go to other cultures and places, see people who don't look, pray, speak, eat like you'll quickly understand you share a common core of humanity. So the boogeyman that people like to blame for all of our ills, that's gone. And once you get rid of ignorance, then intolerance falls as well, because ignorance is like a blood supply to the cancer of intolerance. So I read and I traveled the world without a plane ticket or a passport through the library. And I fell in love with the world of words. And when I was 8, my mom gave me a little journal, and I started writing some of my stories down in the journal. And I found out years later, after I was a published writer, and I went to my mom and thanked her for this gift she gave me that changed the direction of my life. She goes, "Honey, I'm so glad it's worked out for you. But quite frankly, I just wanted to shut you the hell up." you know? So, I remember her good old Southern phrase was, "You'd gotten on my last nerve, boy." And so that really changed my life. And when I was thinking about what I wanted to do with my life, I went to college. I was a political science major. What could I do with that except teach? And I had to get an advanced degree. And I thought, well, I like to write, I like to research, I like to stand up and talk, and lawyers do that. So I applied to law school and got into UVA, the University of Virginia. And as a lawyer, as a trial lawyer, my job was to tell a story, before a judge or a jury. And I had the same set of facts as the other side. That's the trial record. But I had to tell the story that was completely different than the one they were telling. And the way I did it was that I emphasized facts that helped my client and sort of countered facts that didn't help my client. And the word choices, the only arrows in my quiver were words as a lawyer. So my whole world was just like a writer. My whole world were with words. And the transition from becoming a full-time lawyer to a full-time writer wasn't all that different because I've been telling stories for decades. And so the two professions, John Grisham, Scott Turow, and others will tell you, there is compatibility between those two professions. And so my whole world from a young age has really been dominated by two things, books and writing. And my whole world revolves around words. And they are powerful things, and they can change the world. They can change people's minds. And that's a powerful tool.
Well, that's very interesting. My daughter went to law school, got California, passed the bar, became a lawyer, and then she recently quit her job to write books. So, but and she said the same thing. She said, in the law, she was a trial attorney. She said, in the law, you have to learn how to take a bunch of crazy facts and make them into a story, and it's got to be a good story, and it has to be an accurate story as well. And I think that you're kind of said the same thing for yourself. But when you were practicing law, when did you say, I'd rather be writing books? And how did you do it? I mean, it's hard for her to make the transition because all of a sudden she isn't making any money.
I
And
know.
how did
Yeah.
you do it?
I didn't have that option because I was married and I had one child at that point. So I wrote all the way through high school, college, law school, practicing law. A friend of mine went out to LA when I was practicing law to try to break into film as a producer, and he came back with a script. I'd never read a script before. And I read the script he brought back, and I thought, that's an interesting way to tell a story. So I had an idea for a script called Reverse Order, this is 1991. And Reverse Order was like Die Hard in the White House 20 years before they actually made those movies, right?
Mhm.
And I wrote the script, got an agent in LA, surreptitiously. None of my law firm didn't even know I was doing any of this. And I was in Islip, New York. I'd been flown up there with a team of attorneys to over this big legal case, boring as hell. And the whole time this was happening, my script was out in Hollywood, hopefully hitting, the auction block. And my agent would call and say, it looks like the coverage is good. People are excited. Warner Brothers is talking about it. And then I got back to my hotel late that night and called, and she goes, well, Universal passed on it. So all the other studios passed on it. They figured something must be wrong with it. So it didn't sell. I'm sorry. And I remember staring out the window in Long Island that night thinking, well, maybe the break's just not going to happen for me. I've been writing a long time, really nothing to show for it. And I flew back home, and I could have just said, screw it, I'll just be an attorney for the rest of my career and that'll be it. But I couldn't stop writing. I mean, it's like asking me to stop breathing. So I remember walking around lunch one day. My law office was near the White House, and I was a big history buff. I'd read all about John F. Kennedy and his trysts and during some of these affairs. And so my thought was, well, what if the president during one of these affairs, something really bad happens? And the woman he's with, he gets really violent and she defends herself, and the Secret Service have to kill her to defend the president because that life can't end. And somebody sees it all and they run away with some evidence. I thought that's an interesting premise. It turns all the moral dilemmas on upside down. And I spent 3 years in my spare time while I was practicing law, early at night, late or early in the morning, and wrote the novel over 3 years. And I sent it up to some agents and got an agent, and then the book sold. And that was the first time that I finally felt the flexibility for my wife and I to sit down and say, I've got a lot of stories. I think I can build a career as a writer. Now that we've got a little bit of a financial cushion with this book, I think I'm going to leave the practice of law and try to build a career as a writer. And if I fail, I'm a good lawyer. I can go back to practicing law. So we agreed that I should try it, and I did. And really, that's how it went.
And so when Absolute Power was published, did you expect it to be a bestseller, or were you totally surprised? I mean, how long did it take for it to hit the list? I'm curious to hear about that.
Yeah, it hit the list the very first week out, and it stayed on the list for 5 more months. But I didn't know if that was going to happen. We both know, particularly back then, first novel has a lot of hoopla behind it. You get a really good advance. And if it fails, that's it. You're done. The publisher's not going to come back again with anything. So it was a lot of pressure. And I didn't know if this was going to be it. I was going to be a one and done sort of person. So it was very stressful. I was so excited to get the book published. It was a dream of mine. But then came the reality of the business of publishing. They took a chance on me. And if it didn't pay off, then that was it. And that was going to be all I was ever going to do. So I was very fortunate that all the moons were in alignment, that the public really reacted to the novel well, that it sold a lot of copies. The publisher was happy, and they gave me a contract for a book I'd started writing after I finished Absolute Power. I started writing the second novel before Absolute Power was even sold because I had no idea if that book was going to sell or not. And I had an idea for another novel anyway, so I just went off and started writing it. But it all turned out, and the movie deal was made, and the movie was made, and that helped with sales as well. So it all clicked for me. But I also have great empathy for writers who none of that has happened to, and they work hard every day, and they haven't met the person at the right time, who really connects with the material. So they're on the outside of the glass looking in. I was on the outside of the glass looking in for a long, long time. I know what that feels like. So I have great empathy for writers who get up every day and work really hard trying to build a career. Sometimes, Doug, as we both know, it's just the luck of the right person running into your material at the right time and taking a shot, a chance on you. And it could have easily not happened for me. Some of this, I work hard, you work hard, but some of it is luck, some of it is serendipity, some of it is beyond our control. All we can do as a writer is write something we feel really good about and give it to somebody to put us in a position with an opportunity to be successful. That's all we really can do.
Yeah. So during the making of the film, did you have anything to do with that? Did you meet with
Oh yeah,
Eastwood and Hackman?
I did. And I went to the film sets. I met all the stars. I went to the premieres, one in LA and DC and in London. The coolest thing for me was I got to spend a lot of time with Bill Goldman, who wrote the screenplay. And I mean, what a fascinating guy he was and the career that he had. And I remember he called up because he was brought on by the studio to write the script before Eastwood signed on. And the first draft was very much in tune with the novel. There was the burglar who the Clint Eastwood played the character, who in the novel dies halfway through, this young lawyer who then carries on the narrative and discovers the truth and renders justice. So when Eastwood signed on, Bill called me up and said, I've got great news and I've got terrible news for you. And I said, okay, what's the great news? Clint Eastwood is signed to star, direct, and produce your film. Warner Brothers has greenlighted it. You're going to have your movie. I was like, my God, Clint Eastwood, that's awesome. I said, what's the bad news? He goes, the bad news is that Clint Eastwood has signed to star, direct, and produce your film. Your young hero is gone, and I have to figure out a way to keep Eastwood alive throughout the entire movie. And I remember one night, like a few months later, Bill called me late at night and clearly frustrated. And he was like, I can't figure out how to keep the SOB alive. You want to have a shot at it? I was like, no, I don't. I spent 3 years of my life killing him. So no, I don't want to have my shot. So that was quite something. And Bill wrote a sequel to his book Adventures in the Screen Trade, and he devoted an entire chapter to Absolute Power and the complexity of writing that screenplay and working with Eastwood, who is a phenomenal director. I mean, he just directed I don't know, his 50th movie, Juror Number Two. He's 94. He just finished directing a Hollywood film, brought it in under budget, and under schedule, and most people don't do that. But I saw that with him when he was directing Absolute Power. He was also starring it. I mean, as a director, he would go and set up the shot, get all the production companies, all the divisions, the gaffers, electricians, the actors, costume, everything where it needed to be. Then he would change in the costume, get in front of the camera, act, come out behind the camera, check the shot. If he needed to do another one, he would, and then move on. I mean, that's hard to do.
That's amazing. I hope to be alive at 94, not
I know
let
most
alone directing films. So were you okay with those changes then? That your character lives instead of dies?
Yeah, you've got to set that aside. I've adapted one of my own films, books for feature film, Wish You Well, with Ellen Burstyn and Josh Lucas. And you've got to set that aside. It's apples and oranges. So when I adapted Wish You Well, it was a 400-page novel. I had to turn it into a 110-page screenplay. So what I had to decide to do, what part of the book do I want to write? Because there's not room for everything else. And you have to start slicing out subplots and peripheral characters and really hone in the essence of what the story is about, because that's all you have time to do in an hour and 50 minutes. So I respect screenwriters a lot. And what I try to do, I've sold a bunch of material and series. I have Amos Decker and Atlee Pine set up at Amazon. I've got the 620 Man, a series of films set up at Netflix. I've got the Camel Club at NBC Universal. I'm about to sell the Will Roby series. All of them have showrunners, writers attached. And I met with all of them. And the best thing you can do as a writer is to meet with the showrunners or writers who's going to be adapting it and get the vision for what they feel, and if you can do it before you sign the contract, even better. Because as a lawyer, I can tell you, you can have a contract that says you have all the power in the world. At the end of the day, realistically, you only have all the power in the world, just as much as are you willing to go to court with Warner Brothers for the next 20 years of your life. If you're not, then you have no power at all. That's just the way the world works. So I just try to get people around me involved in the project to share the basic vision of the story and the characters. And if it's close enough, it can't be the same, and I understand that, then I go ahead and sign the deal. And then what I try to do is, instead of disassociating myself from the process, I let them all know that I'm an asset here for you to use. You have questions about where the characters came from, what I was thinking about for a particular scene or an arc, call me, Zoom, text me. We will talk about it. I will help you make this as good as it possibly can be, because it will reflect on me as well. I'll still always have the book, but a lot of more people will watch the movie or the TV series and will read the book. That's just a numbers game. And I want it to be as good as it possibly can be. So I try to keep myself involved in the process, in a basis where I'm not saying I control the process. And let me tell you, you never want to control the process, because my advice to young writers, you never want to have so much control over a TV or film project such that if it fails, they can blame and then sue you, and they will, trust me.
Oh, well, you're a lawyer. That's very good advice. I never thought of that. Metal, but not too much.
Right, exactly
Just the
right.
right amount.
Well said.
Yeah, well, that's great. Wow, so many projects going. Do you spend time in Hollywood, or do you pretty much stay in Virginia and let them do their
I,
thing out there?
yeah, I don't, I go out to Hollywood maybe once every couple of years, and I meet with the people I need to meet with, but most of it can be done through Zooms and phone calls. I don't, that's not my world. That's not where I want to spend my time. I'm a novelist. You're a novelist. We need to be where we need to be to do what we need to do. I don't want to be in meetings and on phone calls, 8 hours a day, because that's just not the life I want to be in. But again, I'm there to help them when they need it. And I'll give notes on scripts. I'll give notes on casting. And if they let me see some of the dailies while they're shooting, I'll give notes on that too. And I've done all of that with some of the film projects. But that's not my world. My world is what you and I do.
Well, that's good. That's a lot of common sense, because I'm sure we both know writers who have succumbed to the dream of Hollywood,
Yeah.
and they stop writing books and they go out there and they start writing screenplays, and every single one of my friends who have done that, it has ended in disaster and heartbreak.
No, you're absolutely right. It's just, the one does not easily transition into the other. As a novelist, we're sort of the master and commander, not to say that we have an editing process, we listen to comments from our editor and all that, but at the end of the day, we have the final say over what it's going to be, and we can reject anything out there. It's totally collaborative. Novelists are up here in the mountain in the publishing world. Screenwriters in the Hollywood world, my hands are so low you can't even see them. That's where the writers are, down here. It's a director's town. And I've been on projects where, they fired writers 3 times, and because they didn't like what they were doing. And that's not where I want to be. I do not want to be, a peasant in the world of Hollywood. And writing at the mercy of someone that I may not agree with. So no, I'm always going to be on the periphery.
Well, that's good. Yeah, we when we write a good book, we know it's going to be published. But if you write the best screenplay in the world, it's still a long shot. So
Big time long shot.
yeah, I'm not sure Hollywood is really entirely a meritocracy the way book publishing is, but
No, no, it's not. There's so many different factors that go into it. Who do you know? Who's available? Who's hot? Who's not? What's trending? What's not? I mean, I need an algorithm to figure it all out, and I just don't have the time for the rest of the years I have left on this earth to go through that. I just
yeah. Well, good philosophy. So I'm curious to know a little bit about what your writing day is like, and your writing week and your writing year. Are you 9 to 5, 5 days a week, or do you have odd hours, or write from midnight till 3, or what do you do?
I'm sort of a trains, planes, and automobile kind of guy. I like right here. This is my office outside the house. It's in Reston, near my home. And if I'm in town, I come here every day, and I usually write. I don't have a set hours or pages or words. I just kind of write until the tank is empty. I may not write every day, but I'm immersed in that world every day where I'm constantly thinking about it. So I could write early in the morning, in the middle of the afternoon, late at night, all three. Every day is a little bit different. It's not to say that I'm not disciplined and structured in my day, but I know you know this. You can't turn it off. I mean, even if I'm not sitting here at my desk writing, I'm actually writing if I'm walking down the street or running to get some groceries, or, I'm at a party during the holidays and somebody walks by and looks at me and I'm staring at the wall, and they go ask my wife if I've had a stroke. And my wife looks over and goes, "Stoke, he's just finishing a chapter. Give him 5 more minutes. He'll be back. And I'd like another glass of wine, please."
Well,
Yeah.
my wife sometimes says to me, "You're not listening to me as usual."
Don't, you're not alone on that. You are not alone, because we live in our own little world. I mean, I've always told people that the perfect place to write is not a physical space. It is here. If you're in the zone here and things are crystallized and the words are forming and the scenes are there that you want to get down on paper, that's the perfect place to write. And you want to get yourself in that mindset as often as possible. And you do that by spending a lot of time in your head in that world.
Well, that's interesting. I have a friend, a well-known writer whom I won't mention, who lived part of the year in New York City, and the New York City tax authorities came after him and said, "You're working in New York, and tax prorated on the basis of how many days you work here." And he says, "When I'm in New York, I'm not working." And they said, the IRS agent said, "You're a novelist, aren't you? You're thinking, aren't you? That means you're working." And the IRS actually prevailed on that idea.
Yeah,
So
yeah, yeah. That's why would never buy a place in New York. They're very tenacious about collecting their income tax.
I know, I heard that, and I thought, well, I think I better stop thinking when I go to New York. I'll just be kind of dumb. But it's interesting to hear you say that you write. Really, you're writing all the time. Then you're
Yeah, you are, and I like to call it immersive writing as opposed to writing from an outline. And nothing against outlines. A lot of my writer friends who are hugely successful, they write from outlines, and God bless them, that works for them. It doesn't necessarily work for me. And I've always thought that when I'm writing a novel, I'm in the moment, and the decisions I have to make really count because I'm in the novel. I'm writing the story and things are happening to my characters, not an outline that I might write 2 months before I sit down to write the first page, where I could just write something out and go, I'm not going to think that all the way through. I can fix that later while I'm writing the novel. I'm just going to write something out and leave it open, put a pin in it. But I give the analogy of, like, between writing an outline and writing a novel on a football field. So if you're Tom Brady, where are you going to be the most focused, attentive, and on it? Are you going to do it in practice where nobody's going to touch you, or in a game where 11 guys want to kill you? You're going to be the most focused in the game. And for me, being in the game is being in the pages of the novel itself, where the decisions I make really truly matter, because I'm immersed in what my characters are involved in, whether bullets are flying or a bomb's about to explode or they have to figure something out really fast. I'm there with them, and I've got to do that. So my synapses are firing off better. I see the whole field, all the possibilities, things that I've never really gotten sitting down writing an outline. And again, those who do it and can do it well, God bless them. But for me, it just doesn't work. I have to be in the moment to make the best decisions for my stories.
well. That's what a great metaphor that is. That's really interesting. Yeah, I think that there's a lot of truth in that. That's very very interesting. Yeah. Well, now it's your fans have questions,
Okay.
and I've got some of them here. Um, I know we only have about 15 minutes left, but do you mind if I read you some questions here?
Glad to. Yes, absolutely.
Okay. All right. This one comes from Daniel Falkenhagen, and he wants to know, what is your favorite character trait of the 620 man?
The favorite character trait of the 620 man, you know, is his vulnerability. And when you first meet him, he's sort of a duck out of water in New York. Just to give you, I know most of the readers who have gone through the series know, but he was an Army Ranger. He wanted to spend his entire career in the military and retire because that was his world. That's the world he loved and respected. Something bad happened in the military, partly due to his own fault. So he had to leave. He felt like he had to leave the military under a dark cloud. And so the best part of his life was gone. And he was only 32. And then what does he do? He goes and gets his MBA and he goes to work on Wall Street. Why? because that is penance for him. He hates this life. He doesn't care about making wealth. So this is like his self-inflicted prison term being there. So when you meet the guy, yes, he has this physicality about him, and yeah, he can take care of himself in any type of encounter with other people. But this vulnerability and fragility of, he is living the life that he does not want to live. And people can relate to that because, again, I keep coming back to the theme of characters are the only way for you to connect with the reader on a human level. The plot is not going to do that because most of our plots are they can be out there that most people are never going to be involved in a situation like that. It's just that's why we call them thrillers. But they can connect with a character who has gone through a rough patch in their life and they're trying to figure out their next steps. We've all done that. So his vulnerability and uncertainty about the direction he should take in life is something that everybody can connect to. And that's what I love about him. That's sort of the imperfection in him that I think ties him to a lot of people. They can relate to that and understand it because they've gone through that as well.
Well, that's an interesting answer. Um, all right, this one comes from Barbara Weiskittel, and she wants to know, where do you come up with your storylines? Influenced by real events or an active imagination?
That's a great question, and it is a little of both. I I read voraciously, not just fiction. I read newspapers and magazines and stories online. You never know where an opportunity is going to come around and along, and you need to be able to in the position to receive it. I talked about the 620 man answering a question about all this dark money because I had read those two papers by journalists. In fact, the head of the International Consortium of Journalists, they're made up of reporters who work for free for this, by the way. The New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Economist, the Washington Post. I mentioned them in the 620 man. And the guy who heads it up emailed me and said, I was reading the 620 man and you mentioned us. I like fell out of bed. I couldn't believe it, you know? And so actually they flew to DC and had dinner with my wife and I. And they said, we'd love to work with you because a lot more people read your books than read our, series of papers. And only because I read those because I was interested in what they had found out, all this money floating around. And he said, by the way, your idea, they tilt the world even more in their favor. He said, that's spot on. It's exactly what this money is being used to do. So sometimes it's taking a story out in real life that's actual and asking yourself a question that has not been answered by that story, then using part of your imagination to come in and try to build a scenario and a story that will look to try to answer that question in some fashion. And I've done it, I wrote one book called The Simple Truth, where I had read, when I was in law school, I read a law article about in the 1970s, the CIA wanted to build a super soldier. So they injected unsuspecting soldiers, many of them African American, with PCP to see if they could build super soldiers out of that. And yes, your physicality is greatly enhanced with PCP. The downside is you're not controllable, and it's crazy. And a lot of these soldiers only found out when years later the Army sent them a letter apologizing, and that's the only time they found out. So I thought that is an interesting scenario. Let me see what I can do with a character who gets one of those letters and who might be in prison for a crime that he knows now was induced by PCP that he didn't even know he had taken. And I was often running with that story. So sometimes it's something you read, and then you take that story, add imagination to it, and come out the other end of the tunnel with a whole new take on what you'd read about.
Well, part of this is finding those articles to begin with. How did you find this paper on the dark money paper, for example? I mean, it isn't like it's on the front page of the New York Times.
It's not, but so what I like to do, I go online a lot and read articles from like obscure places. I had heard about this consortium of international journalists just from other readings that I'd done, and they had done a couple of articles in The Economist, which I like to read, and also in the New York Times. And from there, I was on the lookout for other stuff that they had done. And I came upon the Panama Papers and the Pandora Papers that dealt with the same subject matter, just in different iterations. They had discovered some things in the first paper, and more discoveries they made, they wrote about in the second paper. And it was just so fascinating for me. Just one is I follow politics very closely, and I live right outside of Washington, D.C., so we're sort of hit with it in the face every second of every day.
Mm.
And it was fascinating to me. And then I just wrote the 620 man to answer that unanswered question about what do you do with all that money. So that's when I say that the one attribute a writer has to have is to be innately and inexhaustibly curious about everything going on in the world. Because even though we write mysteries and thrillers in scenarios that push the envelope, we still have to have authenticity. We have to have a grounding in real life. And the way to do that is understand what is going on in real life. What are some unanswered questions, in real life that maybe you can write and deal with them fictionally. And I love to do that sort of a thing. So cast a wide net, because as a writer, you have to have the most broadest possible and as deep as you can, but we can only go so deep. I like to call them knowledge pots about 100 different subject matters. And the more you know about lots of different things, you can draw from different pots and put together in a plausible scenario, a comprehensive story. And it's original because nobody's ever thought about combining 9 of those knowledge pots that you have together, because it's sort of unique. Everybody has different knowledge pots. So I call them my knowledge pots. And I try to draw upon them and to bring together things that people normally would not consider being something you would have in one story. It seems a little out there. But the cool thing about something being out there, that means that it's fresh and original and people haven't seen it before. So when you write about it, not only is it like, wow, I've never read anything like this before, then the twists and turns that you can come up with also seem fresh and original, because you're combining elements that just from the get-go by default are original. And so who would ever think about combining 9 of these little pots together, and then the twists and turns sort of just peel away, sort of almost organically from those. And that's what I have the most fun with.
Well, that's really good advice. I that's a reason why so many journalists often become good novelists, because they have access to these pots of knowledge, these weird pots of knowledge, which I love that expression, by the way. That's a good one.
Well, and you're exactly right about that. In fact, the screenwriter who's writing the 620 series, he was a former journalist. He lives in Holland. And when they told me he was a journalist, I jumped for joy, because this book needs a journalist's hand, and it's that innate curiosity. It's that knowledge base they have because they've covered stories from different subject matters all over the world, and they can bring that experience to bear to tell a really good story. I love journalists who turn writers. I think they're exemplary, because that past history and what they've done in past experiences, it's absolutely terrific fodder for transitioning over to the fictional world.
Mark Twain and Ernest Hemingway, for example. So,
Absolutely. Mark Twain cut his teeth, in San Francisco, and in the crime reports and barroom brawls and prostitution. And man, he hit the ground running. He had like 100,000 knowledge pots.
yeah, that's true. All right, let's see here. More questions. Let's see. All right, here's one from Pras Patel. How do you decide if an idea is good enough to be turned into a novel?
That's a great question, and I confronted with that often. And I used to early on, I would just come up with an idea and think, okay, I'm ready to roll on this, and I pop on, and 50 pages in, I'm like, I'm just not feeling it. I don't know where I'm supposed to go with this. So what I try to do now is when I have an idea, like I'll give an example of the 620 Man. I'd read those 2 papers, and so I sat down. Okay, you read the papers, you have this unanswered question. What do you do with all this dark money? That's not enough. You need to think about this through a little bit more than that. So what conceivably you have your main character, you have the setting, New York City, the world of finance, all this money flowing through. What tangential things can you come up with now in this world? What peripheral characters to fill out the world do you have that will carry this narrative for 400 pages? And if you really can't get close to that, I'm not saying you have to be perfect and spot on with everything from the get-go. You don't. But if things are not enough, it's not naturally flowing out, that will allow me to have the energy and creative juice to fill out a novel-length story, then I've got to sit back. Instead of writing those first few pages, I've got to sit back and think about this some more. And I do. I mean, I just don't go off and write willy-nilly anymore. I might go for a walk. I might take a week off and think this through in my head, different scenarios. So if I can think of like 5 or 6 really intense scenes, and I bring in a cluster of 3 to 4 different characters that are going to fill out different parts of what I'm trying to do with this narrative, and get through, like, as I like to say, sort of the first act of where I want to go. And once you get through the first 80 to 90 to 100 pages, you're going to have enough in there to fill out the rest of the novel, because I like to pack everything into that first portion of the novel that then I can build on that, filling out the last 2/3 of it. And with twists and turns that come along that nobody saw coming, but really they are in that first 100 pages, you know? And so once I get to that point where I feel comfortable that, okay, I've got the first 100 pages in mind, not outlined, but in mind of what I wanted to do and what things are going to be thrown off for this that will give me enough ammunition and material to keep going forward. Then I sit down and I write the first 3 or 4 chapters out clean, without stopping. And then I go back and I think about that, and I'm like, okay, I see in my mind sort of the linear designation of where these things are going to go. This guy's going to have to do this. He's going to have 3 or 4 comrades that will have to help him do this, and information sources. Then here are some of the twists and turns. There's a murder here. Who killed the woman? There are suspects along the way. He's got some roommates that he has to deal with. Some of them might be involved. They may not be who we think they are. So I can build out those scenarios, and he can run down those leads. And before you know it, you have far more material than you're ever going to need. And then what you can do is you chip away the weak stuff. It's almost like a statue. You chip away the weak stuff that you thought about including, but you don't need anymore. And you leave the stuff that's really strong and pliable and firm, and you can then manipulate throughout the rest of the 300 pages or so you have to go. That's really how I like to build a story.
That's a nice metaphor, chipping away.
Yeah.
That's a good one. So have you ever had a situation where you write those first chapters and then you stop and you say, no, this isn't going to work, and abandon it?
I have done that because, one, it's not coming out the way that I thought. I might have asked the wrong question. I might have the wrong answer to a question that, I think is still viable. I made a really, I'll tell you, a serious mistake that I made years ago. I wrote a novel called Last Man Standing. It was about this guy named Wed London, who was a member of the hostage rescue team, the FBI. And he was a very, this is his world. His colleagues were his family. And they're deployed on an incident, and they go into this alleyway thinking they're going to be taking out a certain target. And it was a booby trap. They were ambushed, and every member of his team was killed except for him. And when I first wrote that book, it was one of my longest books. I wrote a 140,000 words novel. And I had a very close family member who's going through a traumatic time in their lives. And as a lawyer, I was helping them through this time. And a lot of the stuff that was going on personally for him and me with him carried over and bled into the novel and sort of ruined the novel. So I sent it up, my agent and editor and all that. And they were like, man, this is just not you. Something's really off with this novel. It's just not, it's not good. So I took it back. I cut 130,000 words out and just left that 10,000 words there for like 2 weeks because I had a deadline coming up. You know what deadlines are. And I just zoned out. But at the same time I zoned out, I'm also thinking about where I went wrong, what was wrong with the structure, what did I not do that I should have done in this novel to make it work. And once I got that crystallized and straight in my head, I sat down and wrote another 120,000 words, and in an astonishingly brief period of time, I'm talking like 8 weeks, that I never want to do again in my whole career because that was just not fun at all. But it just goes to show, and I always think about Last Man Standing when I sit down to a new project, and like never ever repeat that mistake again. Don't let anything else bleed into the storytelling from a personal perspective because it will ruin the story. You'll be telling a story, not one you even want to tell. You're going to be actually just registering events from real life, and you don't need to do that. That's not the story that needs to go between the pages. So that for me was a dramatic mistake, but also a really valuable lesson.
Well, that's a scary story right there.
No, it was. It was.
Yeah. Wow. All right. There are more questions here.
Okay.
All right. What do you do if you have writer's block? And that's Marsha Bullock.
People call it writer's block. I just call it part of the writing process. You're never going to be able to think of everything in the novel from the first day. It's just not the way it is, whether you outline it or not. Sometimes even when you outline, you get to a point in the novel and you're like, I didn't think about this during the outline. Now I have a conundrum I have to, face and overcome. And how do I do that? So I have a couple of methods, but all of them center around the fact, get away from the story, go do something else, work on another story, go take a shower, go for a walk, play with your dog if you have a dog, go have a nice lunch, and don't think about it because a part of your subconscious will be thinking about it. I have to say, I have solved more plot issues in the shower than I ever have any other thing that I do. I don't know if it's just the water coming down. You're also, I'm incredibly clean all the time, which also helps. But it's just like this replenishing, I think, of, whatever is going on in your mind. And I have come up with so much cool stuff while taking a shower. And it's just disassociation from the problem. Sometimes you're slamming your head against the wall, trying to figure out. That's the worst thing you can do because your brain is just going to shut down from exhaustion at some point. But trust me, if you move away and go do something else, the really important part of your brain, your subconscious, that's still immersed in the story, it will be trying to solve that problem 99% of the time while you're off doing something totally unrelated, and you will get through it.
Yeah. Well, that's good. I do the same thing. That's excellent advice. I can tell Marcia Bullock that that's the way to overcome writer's block. Just get the heck away for a while. Um, all right, let's see. There are so many good questions here. You've got great fans, by the way.
Sure.
All right, Dwight Herbert would like to know, what would you do as a career if you did not become a writer? And maybe we should say not a lawyer either.
Right. No,
I'm
you're
curious.
my sister was a journalist for her career. I think maybe I would either be a journalist or a teacher, because again, that would meet my criteria for what I want to do in life. Be a lifetime learner, and look into interesting things that I'm curious about and find out about them and write about them, or teach about them. Some of the best and most influential people in my life have been teachers in high school and college and law school, mentors of mine, and they really left an indelible impression on me and what I've done with my life. But journalism, I have the greatest respect for journalists. And as we know, a free and independent press is the mainstay of any democratic society. And so I think if I weren't a writer, of fiction, I would probably want to be a journalist where I still could be able to write, but I'm writing about fact as opposed to fiction. But it would really feed my need, for being curious about things and wanting to learn. I think as a writer, you just have to be a lifelong learner. Every day that I don't learn something new is kind of a lost day in my mind. Life is short enough without doing that.
Well, that's a great answer, and we're now a little bit over time, so I think we probably should wrap this up. David, this has been one of the most interesting interviews I've ever conducted. I really this has been fascinating, and also what good advice for you
Yeah.
and from you. I mean, so read Baldacci if you want to be
And
not
Rick
just a,
Preston too. Come on, let's
no, not just for the pleasure of it, but if you really want to be a writer, Baldacci's the one to do. So I guess I should wrap this up by saying let's have a round of electronic or digital applause for
Well, that's
David Baldacci,
very
and
kind.
thanks for being with us. Oh, look, there are a lot of hearts
I see
and
that.
going
That's
up there.
great.
That's
Doug, I always love spending time with you. You're involved in so many great things. You got me involved in some really great things, and I appreciate that. And we just keep pushing forward together. And it's always a joy spending time with you, man. Always.
well, thank you. You're a very generous guy. You really give back, and more than I think any other writer I know. And
Well,
I'm really thankful for that because the universe has been kind to us. It's kind to some people, but very few of them give back the way you have. So
thank you.
I really want to thank you for that. And the final thing is that I just wanted to mention to everyone who has bought a book that the signed copies will arrive in 8 to 10 business days. And also more books are available from bnn.com. And I believe more signed books are available also, if I believe that's the case. So get those books and put them away. They're going to send your grandchildren through college when you sell them on the rare book market. When your grandchildren sell those books, they're going to be very valuable someday. So anyway, David, thank you again.
Thank
What a
you.
pleasure.
Thank you. Have a great holiday. Take care.
Okay, you too.